The Appalachian Mountains, an ancient spine of earth, rose like a sleeping titan against the bruised morning sky. Their peaks, cloaked in an endless tapestry of pine and deciduous grandeur, breathed a thin, crisp air that carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Valleys cradled secrets in their misty depths, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, and the winding rivers hummed an old, forgotten tune. Here, nature was not just a backdrop. It was a living, breathing entity, its moods shifting with the wind, its silences profound, its sudden bursts of life startling in their vibrant intensity. The human footprint was a delicate impression, easily erased by the relentless march of the seasons. Deep within this verdant wilderness, nestled in a small clearing carved out by generations of calloused hands, stood the Blackwood family's cabin. It was a sturdy, unpretentious structure of hand-hewn logs, its chinked walls holding back the mountain's chill. A wisp of smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, a beacon of human warmth in the vast, indifferent landscape. The small vegetable patch beside it, though hardy, struggled against the shade cast by towering oaks, a testament to the family's persistent toil. This was their world, their sanctuary, a place where the passage of time was marked not by clocks, but by the lengthening shadows and the changing hues of the leaves. Outside, where a sliver of sunlight pierced the overarching branches, Elara Blackwood, the youngest of the clan, knelt amidst a patch of wild blueberries. Her small fingers, stained purple, moved with practiced efficiency, plucking the tiny sweet jewels from their bushes. A wide-brimmed straw hat, salvaged from her mother's quilting scraps, did little to contain the riot of her auburn curls, which bounced with every joyful movement. A small, wicker basket, already half full, sat beside her. A low, tuneless hum escaped her lips, a melody born of contentment. Suddenly, a fat, iridescent beetle scuttled across her path. Elara froze, her eyes, the color of wet moss, widening with fascinated curiosity. She watched its deliberate journey, tracing its path with her gaze until it disappeared beneath a fallen leaf. A soft giggle, like the chime of wind over glass, bubbled up from her throat, scattering the quiet stillness. "You're a busy one, aren't you?" she whispered to the hidden creature, her voice carrying a warmth that defied the cool mountain air. She returned to her task, but her mind had already drifted. She imagined the beetle's underground home, a tiny burrow filled with soft moss and minuscule treasures. Her imagination was a vibrant, boundless place, transforming ordinary moments into grand adventures. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a fairy's skirt, every distant bird call a whispered secret. This innocent joy, this unburdened wonder, was a rare and precious thing in a world that demanded resilience and constant vigilance. A sudden, sharp snap of a twig from deeper in the woods made her pause, her small head cocking to the side. The smile faltered, replaced by a momentary flicker of apprehension. The woods, while familiar, held their own mysteries, their own subtle threats. She knew the tales her father told, stories of bears and wolves, of things that moved unseen in the shadows. But the fear was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by her insatiable curiosity. She pushed aside a curtain of ferns, peering into the deeper gloom, her heart thrumming a little faster. "Hello?" she called out, her voice a thin thread against the vast silence. Only the wind, rustling through the leaves, answered her. She waited, listening intently, her small hand instinctively clutching the basket. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced its way down her spine. It wasn't the same sound as a deer, nor the lumbering gait of a bear. It was different, more deliberate, yet oddly quiet. Deciding it was likely just a squirrel, or perhaps a playful gust of wind, Elara shrugged her small shoulders, dismissing the unease. She was a child of these mountains, and while respect for their wildness was ingrained, fear was a luxury she rarely indulged. Her father always said, "The mountain will tell ye its secrets if ye listen close enough, Elara, but don't go lookin' for troubles it ain't ready to share." She picked up her basket, her earlier joy returning as she envisioned the blueberry pie her mother would bake. The cabin, her family, the warmth of the hearth. These were her anchors in a world both beautiful and untamed. The snap of the twig was forgotten, lost in the sweet promise of berries and the comfort of home. The crisp morning air, still clinging to the night's chill, carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Pa Blackwood, a man carved from the same sturdy oak as the mountains he roamed, checked the fastenings on his deer-hide pack for the third time. His rifle, lovingly cleaned and oiled, rested against the rough-hewn porch post, catching the first hesitant rays of dawn. This was a familiar ritual, a rhythm as ingrained in their lives as the changing seasons. Every autumn, Payne would venture deeper into the wilderness than usual, seeking out the prime hunting grounds that promised enough meat to see them through the lean winter months. Ma Blackwood moved with a quiet efficiency inside the cabin, the clinking of metal against ceramic signaling her final preparations. Her movements were precise, born of years of practice, yet Elara, watching from the doorway, noticed the subtle tightening around her mother's eyes, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. Ma emerged with a small, woven satchel, its contents smelling faintly of dried apples and smoked jerky. She placed it carefully into Pa's already bulging pack, her hand lingering on the worn leather, a silent blessing, a whispered prayer. No words were exchanged, but the unspoken anxieties hung in the air, a fragile veil between them. Thomas, ever the stoic 11-year-old, leaned against the doorframe, whittling a small piece of pine into an unrecognizable shape. He watched his father with an intensity that belied his casual posture, his brow furrowed in a way that mimicked Pa's own thoughtful expression. He'd seen his father depart countless times, but this year something felt different. A heavier weight settled in the hollows of the mountain air. He kicked at a loose stone on the porch, sending it skittering into the dusty yard. Elara, on the other hand, bounced on the balls of her feet, her red braids swaying with each movement. To her 8-year-old mind, Pa's hunting trips were grand adventures, epic quests that ended with tales of cunning deer and mischievous bears. She imagined him traversing perilous ridges, battling fierce winds, and returning a hero. "Will you bring me back a feather, Pa?" she asked, her voice bright, full of untainted hope. "A blue one, from a jaybird." Pa Blackwood knelt, his calloused hand ruffling her hair. His eyes, the color of a deep forest lake, held a tenderness that always surprised Elara. "If the good Lord wills it, little bird," he rumbled, his voice like stones tumbling down a mountainside. He stood then, settling the heavy pack onto his broad shoulders, the leather groaning under the weight. He turned to Ma, and for a fleeting moment their gazes locked, a silent conversation passing between them that Elara couldn't decipher. Ma's hand reached out, brushing his sleeve, a gesture so subtle it was almost missed. "Be careful, John," she said, her voice low, a tremor just beneath the surface. "Always am, Sarah." Pa replied, his tone reassuring, though his eyes held a flicker of something else, something resolute and weary. He gripped his rifle, its polished stock warm against his palm. As Pa started down the narrow path that snaked through the woods, Thomas finally spoke, his voice a little gruffer than usual. "Don't forget to check the traps, Pa." Pa paused, turning to offer a small, almost imperceptible nod. He then disappeared into the dappled light of the forest, the rustle of dry leaves marking his passage. Elara and Thomas stood on the porch, side by side, their small figures silhouetted against the rising sun. Elara waved enthusiastically, a small, vibrant splash of color against the muted cabin. "Goodbye, Pa. Come back soon," she chirped, her voice echoing faintly amongst the trees. Thomas, his whittling forgotten, simply watched the empty path, his young face unreadable, a silent vigil. The familiar ritual of departure had been completed, but this time, the quiet that settled over the Blackwood cabin felt heavier, more profound, a vast stillness that swallowed the chirping birds and the rustling leaves whole. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Appalachians, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Another day bled into night, and the familiar clatter of Pa's axe, the sturdy creak of his boots on the porch, remained absent. Thomas sat on the worn wooden steps, whittling a small bird from a piece of pine. The scent of fresh wood, a hollow comfort. He'd carved its wings too thin, and they snapped with a brittle crack. He tossed the broken bird into the overgrown weeds. Days had merged into a single, stretched-out worry. First, it was just an unusual delay. Pa often stayed out longer if he'd found a good patch of timber or a particularly promising hunting trail. Ma had hummed as she kneaded dough, her voice a little louder than usual, her gaze straying often to the forest's edge. Then the humming had quieted. The dough was still kneaded, but with a new, almost frantic energy. By the end of the first week, the silence in the cabin was a living thing, heavy and cold. Ma's usual bright shawl felt like a shroud. Her once quick smile was replaced by a perpetual faint frown line etched between her eyebrows. Her hands, usually bustling, now rested often in her lap, fingers interlaced, squeezing. "He'll be back, Ma," Thomas said one evening, his voice a little too loud, a little too confident. He was chopping kindling, the axe biting into the wood with a satisfying thwack, trying to fill the quiet with purpose. He imagined Pa, stout and strong, emerging from the tree line any moment, a deer slung over his shoulder, a grin on his face. Ma didn't look up from her mending. A patch of faded blue denim was being coaxed onto a worn knee. "Of course he will, son," she murmured, but her needle paused for a fraction too long before piercing the fabric again. Her answer lacked conviction, a brittle shell of her former assurance. Thomas watched her. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders seemed to slump even when she sat upright. He wanted to scoop her up, tell her everything would be all right, but he was only 12, and his own heart thumped a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He remembered Pa's strong arm around his shoulders, the scent of pine and pipe tobacco that always clung to him. Now, that memory felt distant, like a dream he couldn't quite grasp. He tried to be more helpful, more grown-up. He checked the traps Pa had set, though they'd yielded nothing but a scrawny rabbit and a disgruntled squirrel. He chopped more wood than usual, stacking it neatly by the cabin wall. He even attempted to fix the loose shutter on the window, though his hammering was clumsy and the nails bent. Every task was an effort to push back the creeping fear, to prove to Ma and to himself that they could manage. One afternoon, Ma stood by the door, her hand shielding her eyes as she stared into the dense woods. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and distant wood smoke from a neighbor's hearth. Thomas walked up beside her. "He knows these woods better than anyone, Ma," Thomas offered, his voice softer this time, less performative. "He's probably just lost his way, or found something worth staying for." He hated how hollow the words sounded even to his own ears. Pa Blackwood did not get lost. Not in these mountains. Ma turned to him, her eyes a deep, troubled blue. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Your Pa, he always sends word. Always. Even if he's delayed, he finds a way." A shiver traced its way down Thomas's spine. That was the unsaid truth that had been gnawing at them all. Pa was meticulous. He was reliable. This extended absence, this echoing silence, was not like him. It was an aberration, a tear in the fabric of their predictable, hard-won lives. The air grew colder, even though the sun was still high. The empty days had begun to weigh them down, pushing them closer to an abyss of uncertainty. The last sliver of sun had dipped below the ridge, bleeding the sky in bruised purples and deep, melancholic blues. A chill wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles, snaked through the gaps in the cabin's chinking. Elara, perched on an overturned bucket by the hearth, was tracing patterns in the cooling ash with a stick, lost in the shifting shapes of imagined beasts. Thomas, ever vigilant, stood by the window, his breath fogging the pane as he peered into the deepening twilight. He'd been there for an hour, a sentinel against the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, his posture stiffened. "Ma, Elara, look!" His voice, usually steady, held a tremor of disbelief. Elara dropped her stick. the clatter echoing in the quiet room. She scurried to the window, peering over Thomas's shoulder. Ma, who had been mending a frayed blanket by the dim lantern light, dropped her needlework with a soft thud. Deep within the gnarled tangle of the woods, where the ancient oaks grew thickest and the shadows clung like shrouds, a light pulsed. It wasn't the steady glow of a distant campfire, nor the fleeting flash of a firefly. This light flickered, a breathless, rapid pulse of pale gold, then extinguished itself only to reappear moments later, a ghost in the encroaching gloom. It seemed to hang suspended, defying the physics of anything Elara had ever known. "What in tarnation?" Ma whispered, her voice rough with a fear she rarely allowed to surface. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, her knuckles white. Elara felt a prickle of unease, but her inherent curiosity warred with it. "It's like a star fell, Thomas," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. The light, though distant, held an almost magnetic pull. Thomas, however, saw something more unsettling. "It's moving, Elara," he corrected, his brow furrowed. "See? It was there, now it's a little to the left." Indeed, the golden spark seemed to drift, an aimless beacon in the impenetrable dark, its erratic rhythm hypnotizing. A primal fear began to coil in Ma Blackwood's gut. This wasn't nature. This wasn't an animal's eyes reflecting the moonlight. This was something else. Yet, beneath the dread, a tiny, desperate ember of hope ignited. Pa. He'd been gone for days, searching for the lost deer trail, for signs of a better hunting ground. Could it be him? A signal? He'd never carry a light like that, though. Pa was practical, his lantern a steady, reliable beam. This was capricious. Could it be Pa? Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper, echoing Ma's unspoken thought. Hope flickered in her own eyes, chasing away some of the wonder. Thomas shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the dancing light. Pa wouldn't be so careless with a flame in the deep woods, Elara. Not with dry leaves everywhere. His reasoning was sound, practical, yet the conviction in his voice wavered slightly. He wanted it to be Pa as much as anyone, but his gut screamed otherwise. That light felt wrong, alien. The flickering intensified, almost frantic, then dimmed to a mere pinprick before flaring again, brighter than before, painting the undersides of the lowest branches in an unearthly, fleeting gold. It pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, like a heart struggling to beat. Ma Blackwood clutched her mending, her fingers digging into the worn fabric. Her earlier terror had given way to a confusing cocktail of emotions. The logical part of her knew this couldn't be Pa. The desperate, yearning part of her, however, clung to the possibility with a fierce, almost irrational grip. What if he was hurt? What if he was signaling for help, using whatever he could find? But the nature of the light, it felt less like a call for aid, and more like a silent, mesmerizing lure. A new kind of fear, cold and insidious, began to weave itself through her fragile hope. The woods, which had always been a source of sustenance and solace, now held a new, inexplicable threat, beckoning from its darkest heart. Ma Blackwood stood by the hearth, her silhouette stark against the dying embers. The cabin, usually a symphony of crackling wood and soft snores, was hushed, save for the incessant scratching of a branch against the window pane. It had been 3 days since Pa left, 3 days of Ma's quiet prayers and increasingly frantic pacing. Elara, curled tight under her patchwork quilt, watched her mother's shoulders sag, then stiffen. Thomas, ever vigilant, sat hunched on his stool, whittling a piece of cedar into a crude bird, his brow furrowed in concentration that didn't quite mask his worry. "He's not coming back," Ma finally whispered, her voice rough, more to herself than to the children. "Not on his own." Elara's breath hitched. The words, though expected, were a cold plunge. Pa had always returned. Always. Thomas dropped his whittling knife with a soft clatter. His eyes, usually bright with mischief, were wide and shadowed. Ma turned, her face etched with a fear Elara rarely saw. But beneath the fear, a flicker, like flint striking steel. "We're going to find him," Thomas's head snapped up. "Ma, the woods at night!" "I know, Thomas," she interrupted, her voice gaining a steely edge. "I know what those woods can do. But he's out there, and we're going." She walked over to the worn oak chest by the bed, pulling out a faded canvas bag. "We'll need food. Just enough. And blankets." Elara scrambled out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cold floorboards with a shock. She felt a strange mix of terror and exhilarating purpose. This wasn't a game of hide-and-seek. This was real, a grown-up adventure, but the stakes were Pa. She watched Ma methodically pack dried jerky, a few hard biscuits, and the small, tarnished tin of emergency matches. Thomas, meanwhile, was already at the water barrel, filling a leather canteen. He moved with a practiced efficiency, his usual boyish clumsiness replaced by a focused resolve. "Elara," Ma said, her voice softer now but firm, "fetch the thickest shawl from the peg, and your warmest boots." Elara rushed to obey, her heart thrumming. She pulled on the stiff leather boots, the laces, a familiar comfort, and wrapped the scratchy wool shawl around her small frame. The cabin, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, holding them back from the unknown. Before they left, Ma went to the hearth, dousing the remaining embers with a dipper of water. The hiss and steam filled the small space, a final farewell to warmth. The cabin fell into a deeper chill, the faint scent of wood smoke quickly dissipating. Thomas secured the latch on the heavy oak door, then tested it, twice. His grip on the worn wooden handle of his father's hunting axe was tight, his knuckles white. The moon was a sliver, a thin, curved fingernail scratching at the inky canvas of the sky. The air, usually crisp, felt heavy, almost oppressive. The familiar pines, usually a comforting backdrop, now loomed, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching into the black. As they stepped out, the silence of the night was not empty, but filled with 1,000 tiny sounds, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant hoot of an owl, and the low, sibilant whispers of the wind weaving through the dense foliage. Elara shivered, not just from the cold. The woods truly whispered tonight, a secret language she was suddenly desperate to understand and terrified to interpret. She looked back at their cabin, a dark, silent sentinel swallowed by the encroaching shadows. It felt like a lifetime ago that Pa had kissed her forehead before venturing into this very darkness. Ma took her hand, her grip firm and reassuring, yet Elara could feel the tremble in her fingers. Thomas, a protective shadow, led the way, his gaze fixed on the barely discernible path. They were leaving warmth and safety behind, stepping into a world that felt both ancient and alive, a world that held their father captive. The whispers grew louder, beckoning them deeper, into the heart of the unknown. The light, a playful flicker of amber and gold, danced ahead, teasing them with its promise of warmth and direction. Elara, her small hand clutching Thomas's worn sleeve, felt a surge of renewed hope each time it appeared through the tangled branches. "There it is again," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. Thomas, his brow furrowed, quickened his pace, his eyes fixed on the elusive glow. It was like a willow, the wisp, always just a little further, always just out of reach. They had been following it for what felt like an eternity, the forest growing denser with each step. The familiar path they'd sought had long since vanished, swallowed by thickets of thorny brambles and gnarled roots that clawed at their ankles. Thomas, despite the growing unease tightening in his chest, tried to project an air of confidence. "Just a little further, Elara. It's gotta be a cabin, or a trapper's fire." He didn't quite believe his own words, the light too erratic, too unmoored, to be a human beacon. It winked out for long moments, plunging them into oppressive darkness, only to reappear in a new, unexpected direction, always drawing them deeper into the embrace of the ancient woods. The terrain grew unforgiving. Low-hanging branches, heavy with damp moss, slapped at their faces. The ground beneath their feet was a treacherous tapestry of fallen timber and slick, decaying leaves, making every step a deliberate, cautious act. Elara stumbled, catching herself on Thomas's arm. Her initial excitement had begun to wane, replaced by a dull ache in her legs and a prickle of fear at the back of her neck. "Thomas, it's going deeper, isn't it?" Her small voice was laced with a dawning realization. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze sweeping the shadowy expanse around them. The trees here were different. Taller, older, their bark scarred and gnarled like ancient faces. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. A faint, wild odor that Elara couldn't quite place but found unsettling. The light reappeared, a distant, mocking spark through a curtain of pines. "It's leading us astray," Thomas murmured, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. He should have seen it sooner, should have trusted his instincts, that this light was not of man. His mother, her face etched with worry, coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made both children wince. She leaned heavily on his father, her strength visibly flagging. Maybe we should stop," she whispered, her voice reedy and strained. But the fear of the unknown that lurked in the deeper woods, the unseen creatures that stirred in the darkness, was a powerful motivator. The flickering light, however deceptive, offered a focal point, a direction, even if it was the wrong one. It was a tangible object in a world that had suddenly become formless and terrifying. Thomas looked back at his mother, then at Elara, whose eyes, wide and fearful, mirrored his own dawning apprehension. They were lost, truly lost, and this captivating light, their only guide, was pulling them further into the labyrinthine heart of the wilderness. The path, if it could even be called that, narrowed to a barely discernible track. Winding between massive boulders draped in thick ivy, the undergrowth became a dense, impenetrable wall of thorny bushes and unseen creepers that snagged at their clothing. Elara felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She didn't want to worry Thomas more. He was already carrying too much. He pushed aside a particularly stubborn curtain of vines, revealing a narrow chasm ahead. The light, as if beckoning them to cross, shimmered tantalizingly on the other side. A cold gust of wind snaked through the gap, carrying with it a faint, mournful whisper. Thomas hesitated, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. This wasn't just a wrong turn anymore. This was an active, deliberate deception. He glanced back at his family, their faces pale and drawn in the encroaching gloom. The forest had become a living, breathing entity, pressing in on them from all sides, its ancient secrets palpable in the suffocating air. The elusive light, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a predatory gaze, drawing them deeper into its snare. The dense undergrowth, a relentless tapestry of ferns and thorny vines, had been particularly unforgiving for the last hour. Thomas, his brow furrowed in concentration, swung his axe with a practiced rhythm, clearing a path just wide enough for Elara and Ma to follow. He grunted with effort, a stray bead of sweat tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "Hold on, Elara," he called back, his voice a little hoarse. "Almost through this thicket." Elara, clutching the worn doll Ma had sewn for her, peered through a gap in the foliage. "Look, Thomas, something's there." She pointed with a small, gloved finger. Thomas paused, wiping his sleeve across his forehead. He pushed aside a curtain of tangled branches. What they saw wasn't a clearing, but a faint indentation in the earth, barely discernible beneath a layer of fallen leaves and moss. It snaked deeper into the woods, a subtle scar on the otherwise pristine wilderness. Ma knelt, her fingers brushing the earth. "It's a trail," she murmured, her voice laced with a strange mix of awe and trepidation. "An old one. See how the trees grow almost over it?" Indeed, ancient oaks and towering pines leaned inward, their branches forming a natural archway that seemed to swallow the faint path whole. The air here felt different, cooler, as if the forest itself held its breath. Thomas, ever the pragmatist, examined the ground. "No fresh tracks, Ma. Been a long time since anyone walked here." He still held the axe, its glinting blade a stark contrast to the dappled shadows. A surge of curiosity, mingled with a prickle of unease, urged him forward. This wasn't on their map. Not that their hastily drawn charcoal sketch was much help anymore. As they stepped onto the forgotten trail, a profound silence descended. It wasn't just the absence of their own rustling, or the distant calls of unseen birds. It was an absolute, heavy quiet that pressed in on them from all sides. The usual hum of insects, the whisper of leaves, a snap of twigs underfoot, all vanished. It was as if the forest had suddenly muted itself, holding its breath in anticipation. Elara's grip on her doll tightened. She looked up at Thomas, her wide eyes reflecting the deepening shadows. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's quiet." Her whisper, usually so soft, seemed to echo in the oppressive stillness. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine, unrelated to the cooling air. He strained his ears, listening for anything. A breeze, a chirp, the distant rumble of a brook. Nothing. Not even the rustle of the leaves that had been so persistent moments before. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that precedes a storm, or, perhaps, something far more sinister. His own heartbeat, a frantic drum against his ribs, suddenly seemed deafening. He could almost hear Elara's, a quick, fluttery pulse beside him. Ma, usually so stoic, had her hand pressed to her chest, her breathing shallow. The silence stretched, vast and suffocating, making the familiar woods feel utterly alien. Every rustle of their clothes, every intake of breath, was amplified, a jarring intrusion into the profound stillness. Thomas gripped his axe tighter, the weight of it a small comfort in the suddenly unnerving world. He felt an inexplicable urge to shout, to break the spell, but the words caught in his throat, held captive by the pervasive hush. The trail, once a promise of a new way forward, now felt like a path into the very heart of the silence. The thin air bit at Elara's cheeks, painting them a raw, mottled red. She skipped ahead, her worn boots kicking up sprays of damp earth, until a glint of metal caught her eye. It wasn't the sparkling mica she sometimes found by the creek, nor the dull gleam of a fallen axe head. This was sharper, more purposeful. Thomas, a few paces behind, his breath fogging in crisp puffs, saw her freeze. "What is it, Elara?" His voice, though still boyish, carried a new edge of apprehension. The cheerful energy that had propelled them from the cabin earlier had steadily dissipated, replaced by a growing quietude. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, now seemed to hold a sinister weight. Elara didn't answer immediately. She simply pointed. Embedded deep into the splintered crown of a broad, ancient oak stump, its gnarled roots clawing at the rocky soil, was a knife. The hilt, made of dark, polished horn, was unmistakable. Pa's hunting knife. Its blade, usually a mirror sheen, was dulled by a fine film of condensation, but the distinctive curve at the tip, the slight nick near the guard from where he'd once pried open a stubborn crate, were seared into their memories. It was thrust in hard, as if in haste or anger, the point buried almost to the hilt. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen Pa clean that knife countless times, honing its edge until it could split a hair. Pa never left his tools behind, especially not his hunting knife. It was an extension of his hand, a lifeline in the unforgiving wilderness. He approached slowly, his steps tentative on the mossy ground. The silence that followed Elara's discovery was profound, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. "Pa's knife," Elara whispered, the wonder in her voice replaced by a fragile tremor. She reached out a hesitant finger, then pulled back, as if afraid to touch a ghost. Thomas knelt, his gaze sweeping the immediate area. The ground was hard, rocky in places, covered by a scattering of fallen leaves. No footprints were visible other than their own, No sign of a struggle, no discarded scraps of cloth, no overturned satchel. Nothing. The knife was just there, an isolated, chilling sentinel. He reached for the hilt, his fingers closing around the cold horn. He pulled. It didn't budge. It was wedged in tight, a silent testament to the force with which it had been driven home. He wouldn't just leave it, Thomas said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual youthful bravado. He tried again, bracing his feet, and with a grunt, wrenched the knife free. The wood groaned in protest, releasing its hold with a soft, tearing sound. He held the knife, its weight familiar, yet imbued now with a heavy sense of dread. The blade was clean, without a single fleck of blood or stain. It was as if it had been placed there, deliberately, for them to find. Elara's eyes, wide and searching, scanned the surrounding woods. "Do you think he just forgot it?" But even as she spoke the words, they sounded hollow, unbelievable. Thomas shook his head, his brow furrowed in a deep V. "Pa never forgets anything important, Elara, especially not this." He sheathed the knife in his own belt, the cold metal a stark presence against his hip. He felt an urge to shout, to call out Pa's name, but a deeper instinct, a primal fear, held his tongue. Just then, a chill, unlike any they had felt all morning, descended. It wasn't just the air growing colder. It was a damp, clinging sensation that seemed to seep into their bones. From the hollows between the ancient trees, a thick, milky white fog began to roll in. It wasn't a gradual creeping. It was a sudden, silent invasion. Tendrils of mist snaked through the undergrowth, obscuring the familiar outlines of bushes and rocks. Within moments, the towering oaks that had provided their bearings were swallowed whole, their upper branches disappearing into the swirling vapor. The world shrank to a small, indistinct circle around them. The distant caw of the crow was muffled, then silenced. The air grew heavy, damp, and still. Elara instinctively moved closer to Thomas, her hand finding his sleeve and clutching it tight. The visibility dropped to mere feet, transforming the once familiar woods into an alien landscape of shifting shadows and formless shapes. The biting cold intensified, a raw, penetrating dampness that promised to chill them to the marrow. Thomas could feel Elara trembling beside him, and for the first time, a genuine, unadulterated fear tightened its icy grip around his own heart. Elara shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fog hadn't just rolled in, it had attacked, a sudden, suffocating blanket that swallowed the last glimmers of afternoon sun. One moment, the familiar, jagged peaks of the Appalachians had been etched against a bruised sky. The next, a milky, impenetrable wall had descended, muffling sound and stealing sight. "It's thicker than a winter stew," Thomas muttered, his voice a little too loud in the sudden quiet. He stood near the cabin door, a hand resting on the rough-hewn timber, as if for reassurance. He'd been trying to chop more firewood when it hit, and now his axe lay forgotten, half buried in a stump. Elara peered into the swirling white, her breath pluming in front of her. "It looks like spun cloud, Tommy. Do you think we could fly in it?" She imagined herself light as a feather, drifting above the treetops, the world a soft, indistinct blur beneath her. Thomas snorted, trying to inject some bravado into his tone. "Don't be daft, Elara. We'd just get lost. This ain't no ordinary fog." His eyes, usually so keen, darted nervously into the swirling vapor. He'd seen plenty of mountain fogs in his 11 years, but this felt different. It clung to the skin, a damp, icy tendril that seeped into bones. Their mother had gone inside when the first tendrils appeared, fussing about the supper fire. Now, the cabin's light, usually a warm beacon, seemed muted, struggling to pierce the oppressive whiteness. "We should go in, Elara," Thomas urged, his hand reaching for hers. "Mama will be worried." As they stepped inside, the chill of the fog seemed to follow them, seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. The air within felt heavy, laden with an unspoken tension. Their mother, her face etched with concern, was stirring a pot over the hearth, but her gaze kept straying to the small window, now a solid white square. Night fell, or at least the clock claimed it did. Outside, the fog remained, a living, breathing entity pressed against their small dwelling. Sleep was a restless thing, punctuated by the mournful hoot of an owl that sounded unnervingly close, then impossibly far. Elara dreamt of walking through endless mist, searching for a familiar face that always remained just out of reach. Thomas tossed and turned, convinced he heard whispers carried on the damp air, just beyond the reach of his understanding. Morning brought no relief. If anything, the fog had grown denser, if such a thing were possible. The air crackled with an unseen energy, raising the hairs on Elara's arms. Thomas, ever practical, decided they needed to check their snares. Their mother, after a moment's hesitation, agreed, her voice tight with apprehension. "Just stick together, boys. Don't stray a single step." "We will, Mama," Thomas promised, trying to sound confident. He took Elara's hand, his grip firm. Stepping out, they were immediately engulfed. The world shrank to a few feet around them. Trees that had been their steadfast neighbors were now phantoms, their outlines barely discernible. The ground felt different, too, softer, as if the very earth had been muted. They walked for what felt like hours, calling out occasionally, their voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. The snares were empty, untouched. A growing unease settled in Thomas's gut. The path they knew so well, a worn track leading from the cabin to the stream, had vanished. Every direction looked the same, an endless, shifting canvas of white. "I don't like this, Tommy," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. "It feels like the mountain is holding its breath." Thomas swallowed, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. He tried to retrace their steps, but every tree looked identical, every rock a stranger. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of his composure. He squeezed Elara's hand tighter. "We'll find our way back, Elara, don't you worry." But even as he said it, he knew it was a hollow promise. Suddenly, a gust of wind, sharp and biting, tore through the fog. It swirled, a frantic dance, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it began to dissipate. Wisps of white peeled away, revealing patches of the familiar forest floor. Thomas gasped, his eyes wide. The fog cleared completely, revealing the familiar clearing where their cabin stood. But it didn't stand. Where the sturdy log walls should have been, where the smoke from their chimney should have curled into the crisp morning air, there was nothing. Not a splinter of wood, not a stone from the hearth, not even a patch of disturbed earth. The ground was covered in a pristine layer of pine needles, as if nothing had ever been there. The air, now clear and sharp, hummed with an unnatural silence. Thomas stared, his jaws slack, his mind refusing to comprehend. Elara's soft gasp broke the stillness. "Tommy, where's home?" Her voice was small, bewildered. He stood frozen, his gaze sweeping over the empty space, then to the surrounding trees, then back again. It was gone. Their home, their entire world, had vanished without a trace. A primal scream clawed at his throat, but no sound escaped. From that day forward, no one ever saw the Blackwood family again. Search parties scoured the mountain, calling their names until their voices were hoarse, but found nothing. No tracks, no belongings, not a single sign. The cabin, too, remained an enigma, its disappearance a chilling tale whispered around campfires. Over time, the story of the Blackwoods became a legend, a cautionary tale of the mountain's unfathomable power, of a family swallowed whole by the Appalachian wilderness, leaving behind only the chilling whisper of a vanished cabin and the echoing silence where laughter and life once resided.